Welcome to The Mixtape with Scott, a podcast devoted to learning the personal stories of living economists and some outside economics, with the hope that these stories inspire you and resonate with you and are meaningful to you. And with the other additional hope that if we just listen to a bunch of stories over time, we'll have in aggregate maybe like a bit of the overall picture or the broader collective story of the economics profession itself. I am Scott Cunningham, the host. This week's guest is a buddy of mine down the road from me at Texas A&M, Jonathan Meer. He has a super long title, so I'm going to let him tell you that title. I couldn't in a million years get it right without a piece of paper. John and I have known each other, I think, for over 10 years. He came to Texas in 2009. I came to Texas in 2007, and neither one of us have left. And we always seem to end up at the same conferences and always end up hanging out. He's a person that always makes me laugh and always makes me think. He's just a genuinely fun person to be around. He's a person that writes in applied areas, as well as more specifically in applied areas, very traditional fields like labor economics, which is very close to my heart, and public economics. And he writes in very novel areas kind of within those, like charitable giving, as well as more established areas like education and the minimum wage. In this interview, though, we just talked a lot about his thoughts about being an economist and what it's meant to him and how he got into it and how he sort of knew from a really early age that this is what he wanted to do, making him sort of a unique person that I've ever met. He talks a lot about the good luck that he's had, a theme that has happened in other people that I've spoken with. And really what he loves about economics is just the people. So thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the interview. And if you like it, please share it with somebody, share it with your friends, share it with your enemy so that they'll be so moved by Jonathan's story that they apologize to you for not giving back the lawnmower or for doing some other horrible thing to you. So consider supporting the podcast, though. It's a labor of love, and I do hope you love it, though, even if you don't support it. So I hope that it means a lot to you. Thanks a lot. Well, it is my pleasure to have one of my not to embarrass him, but one of my favorite people in the profession, Dr. Jonathan Meer. Jonathan, good to have you on the podcast.
Glad to be here, Scott.
Before we get started, tell me for the sake of the listener, tell me your name, your job title, and the monopsonist that pays your paycheck.
So my name is Jonathan Meer. I am the Mary Julia and George R. Jordan Professor of Public Policy at the Department of Economics at Texas A&M, where I'm also the Director of Undergraduate Programs and at the moment the Director of Engagement and Outreach in our department.
That sounds like a made-up title.
Well, I did make it up. Yeah. Not the position, though. The title's made up.
The title's made up. Okay. All right. So here's an icebreaker. I'm asking you this because you love to have dinner parties. So if you could host a dinner party with any three people, living, dead, or fictional, you and your wife, who would you invite and why? And then I said, remember, Milton Friedman once said he'd invite Galbraith and Keynes, despite their ideological differences. So who are you going to have at your party and why?
What do you Oscar Wilde for sure. Yeah. I think that's probably the easiest one. That's certainly the first one that leapt to mind. I'm trying to think. I don't want to get too maudlin and pick a relative who I don't get to see anymore. But definitely have Oscar. Actually, you know what? Oscar Wilde might be enough by himself to carry the entire conversation. I think maybe Richard Feynman. That watching the two of them play off each other would probably be pretty fun. So you can tell I'm going for people who are not just incredibly smart, but also wildly entertaining.
Yeah.
And so let's see who else really fits that mold. I'm tempted to say you, Scott.
You want me there?
Yeah, I think you'd round out that group pretty well. No, let's see. So Feynman, Wilde, and Hmm. That is that's true. You know what? We'll stop with five and
All
five. I
right.
think that's enough. I'm not going to get a word in edgewise, and you've known me long enough to know that that's quite a feat.
Yeah. Why do you throw so many parties? Why have you always been like that? What do you love about doing that?
I really enjoy being around people. I enjoy chatting with people. I have so you said dinner parties. I really throw more cocktail parties than anything
Right.
else. Though
Right.
I do like cooking. It's easier to have a big crowd if you're making drinks, and I bring the same unhealthy obsession for detail to cocktail creation that I do to everything else. I think it's fun to get the people I like together and have them interact. And uh, my parties tend to have a really mixed bag of folks from just different parts of my life,
Mm,
and many of them become friends in their own right, which is really enjoyable for me to see.
mm, mm. Yeah. You're sort of a gatherer type. You sort of bring a lot of people together. So let's start at the beginning. So can you tell me a little bit about your early life? Where'd you grow up? What kind of kid were you?
So I was born in Israel, and I
Oh,
was a really annoying kid. But so my parents moved from Romania to Israel in 1979, just before I was born. My
oh,
father was a PhD student in electrical engineering at the Technion in Haifa, and so my parents sacrificed a ton to leave Romania. And then in 1986, when I was 6 years old, we moved to the US, which is where my sister was born. My mom likes to joke that she smuggled kids into two countries. Um, and so again, my parents, sacrificed a ton. And that's something I think you and I have in common, that we care about parenting quite a bit. And I think one of the things you don't realize until you have your own children is just how much your parents did for you. So I'm
Mm,
incredibly appreciative of that. So we lived in Maryland, where my dad was at the University of Maryland until I was about 12. And then we moved to New Jersey. My dad is now emeritus, distinguished professor emeritus of electrical engineering at Rutgers. And so my
mm.
parents still live in New Jersey. So I mostly I'd say I spent my formative years in New Jersey.
Oh, okay. Okay. Wait, what town is Rutgers in?
So Rutgers is it's in New Brunswick, Piscataway. It's kind of scattered, but I grew up in East Brunswick.
East Brunswick. Is that big area? Was it like a small town or what was it like?
It's suburban. It's Central Jersey. Central Jersey is kind of its own thing, and it's just a lot of suburban sprawl. But it's a really
Mm,
good place to grow up. It's a fantastic school district,
mm,
and it's sort of an interesting story, especially, and I think dovetails with my interest in education. And something, again, you don't realize until you get out there and you're studying this stuff yourself. So in New Jersey, each town is its own school district, which is kind of similar to Texas, but not like other states. And my sense is that a combination of families moving in that really valued education, whether it was Jewish families leaving New York City in the 70s and early 80s, South and East Asian families moving in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. There's just a lot of demand from parents for high quality education. You get a really good peer group. And I think the school combination of luck and good management got a really good draw of very high quality teachers who maintained a really powerful ethos of high quality. And
mm,
so, it's sort of hard to chop up what drives what exactly in that education production function. But, I had so many amazing peers, and we all pushed each other, but not in sort of a nasty competitive way. It was just, there was extremely high standards. There were dozens of kids who went to top schools. This is one town in New Jersey sending two kids to Stanford, I think one to Berkeley, two to Harvard, two to MIT, out
mm.
of one cohort. And
Wow.
so you had maybe 3 dozen students out of a class of 500 going to just the absolute top universities. And so that was something that I didn't appreciate until much later. It's sort of the narcissism of being young, right? You think that everything in your experience is the way that everyone's experiencing it.
Right, right, right. Wow, that's really cool. That's been that school sort of has always been that way.
Certainly in my time and even now, It's just a really high quality school.
Hmm. Hmm. That's interesting. You said that it was a lot of it also was peers because we just mentioned how much you enjoy bringing people together. Have you always been like that? You always loved your friends, had friends, and loved them.
I'd say so. I mean, I think we all change as we grow older. I think that I am more comfortable now, kind of guiding things. By the very low standards of academic economists, I'm not particularly dorky. And I'm certainly far less dorky now than I was when I was, a teenager, which, was pretty bad.
Well, what kind of kid were you in high school? Were you always, you said you were super academic, but outside academics, what kind of kid were you?
Well, so I was on the swim team, though not very good, and that was true in college also. And I think that I think awkward might be the right word for it.
Hmm.
Uh, and sort of trying to find my place, trying to figure out who I was. And again, I think in retrospect, being very lucky that there was a large enough group of kids who valued those kinds of attributes that I was not lonely in any way, shape, or form, in the way that I think many people we know might have been like the only kid in their high school who had those kinds of interests. It was not the least bit unusual to have the kinds of interests that I did. I can think off the top of my head of a half dozen kids from my high school graduating class who are professors now.
Oh, huh, huh. So you swam, you're not a good swimmer, but you swam for college.
Yes. So this is another stroke of luck. I'd say I'm not real smart, but I'm real lucky. I'm not a very good athlete, but I'm real lucky. So the legendary, now retired head coach after 40 years of Princeton swimming, Rob Orr, who was head coach from starting in 1979. His view of it was, if you were willing to put in the 30-ish hours a week of intense training to be on a Division I swim team, then you deserve to be on it. And so,
Oh,
despite a lack of particular swimming talent, I got to be on there, and that, I think, had a huge impact on my life. Many of my closest friends are people who I was on the swim team with, who were actually talented
yeah.
athletes, in addition to being really good students. But it absolutely changed the trajectory of my life in a really meaningful way. And so, Rob Orr is one of three people that I think of outside of my family who I think of as having had just enormous influence on the direction of my life.
Huh. Um, that's cool. It's like a Ted Lasso kind of character.
In a manner of speaking, actually, I think there's one of my favorite descriptions of him in a write up in a swimming magazine was something like a part mad scientist, part absent minded professor, but just an all around amazing guy who led through just sheer force of charisma, and established an ethos that carries forward to this day with the phenomenal new coach who's there now.
Mm-hmm. A lot of people, their first touch with economics is like where it really started to matter, where it really kind of grabbed them. It was either a book, a class, or a professor. And it doesn't always happen in the same, at the same time. So I was just kind of curious, do you remember when you first sort of had a positive thing with economics where it sort of grabbed your heart a little bit? Because I know you and I are really similar in that, at least I think you and I both really love economics.
So this is an embarrassing story, but since it's just me and you here, I'll tell it. So it builds a bit and it gets a little bit better. But in ninth grade in New Jersey, there is a state requirement, or at least there was many years ago, for a careers class. And so again, this is kind of pre-internet. So you've got the Occupational Outlook Handbook, and you had to pick a profession and write about it. And I'm just flipping through this thing, and I get to the E's, and I'm like, oh, economist, this sounds kind of interesting. So I may be the only person in the history of the state of New Jersey's careers requirement who actually found their career in the Occupational Outlook Handbook. But what I did find interesting, I found it interesting, and then I just started paying more attention. My parents are both avid readers of the New York Times, so that's something I'd read every day, and you just sort of start to pick up. This is back when the New York Times was quite a bit more even-handed than it is today. But you sort of pick stuff up, and I actually ended up writing at least one college essay about what Justin Wolfers' book refers to. Justin Wolfers and Betsy Stevens' book refers to as the interdependence effect, which was how in the 1973 oil embargo, the sales of hamburgers plummeted. So you're like, okay, well, why? So what's going on there? Well, gasoline got really expensive, and especially in the 70s, people would drive to the drive-through or the drive-in to get burgers. And I said to myself, that's so interesting that these things that appear to be completely unrelated actually are related, and I just thought those kinds of patterns were so fascinating. And so I am one of those weirdos who kind of knew what they wanted to do when they were 15, and having my father as an example, I thought that academic lifestyle was really appealing. And what I love about our job is you get to find the answers to the questions you want to know the answers to.
Right.
So this is sort of funny because when I talk to a lot of undergraduates about career goals, and I sort of advise them away from kind of the bullheaded way I went into things, which was, when I was 15 or 16, I decided that this is what I was going to do, and I never really considered anything else. And it worked out great for me, but there's some survivorship bias involved in telling that story a little too firmly to students. So I kind of tell them to go try some other stuff and figure out whether this is really what you want to do.
Wait, so what age is this for you? So this is like high school where you read that occupation manual, or is it college?
Yeah, so that was ninth grade. That was ninth grade.
You knew you wanted to be an economist in the ninth grade?
Yeah, isn't that weird?
That's the first guest on the show that they've said that.
Well, so and then my parents really value education, as you can imagine, and so the summer before my senior year of high school, I took some summer classes at Yale, and one of them was an intro stats class, and one of them was a principles of micro class. And in retrospect, now that I teach principles of micro to about 3,000 students a year, it was not taught very well. It does give me the opportunity to tell my students that, I tried to brute force memorize my way through, the shutdown condition for firms, and you just don't really learn it that way. Right. But despite that, I still found it just so fascinating. So I went into college knowing exactly what I wanted to do.
That's amazing.
Really didn't look right or left. Again, this isn't a good story, right? This isn't a praiseworthy story. I think it's good to explore and figure out.
Sure. But there's an argument for not waste. When you feel something, getting there earlier. Seems like there's a lot of value in it. I mean, part of what I feel like is the problem with our field is there's so many non-econ prereqs that you have to have that you sort of are at a disadvantage if you catch it too late.
I think that's
you probably
true.
Must have known immediately. I gotta basically double major in math, borderline become a blue collar mathematician.
I think that's true. And again, like I said, I talk to a lot of students, and that's one of the things that I find troubling is that, if you don't catch them when they're freshmen or sophomores, it's almost too late for them to go not necessarily straight into a PhD, which again, not advisable, but kind of go be competitive for a PhD program without adding more school.
Yeah. Why would you tell somebody don't go straight into a PhD program? Isn't that what you did?
It is, and it was a terrible idea. The point of being young is to figure out what you want to do. And okay, if you're convinced and you know for sure what you're getting into, but there's obviously huge information asymmetries here, and a lot of lack of clarity about what this entails. And a lot of times you've probably had this conversation. You talk to a student, they seem really eager, and of course they're smart, and they're like, oh well, I really want to teach. And I'm like, okay, so you have no idea what this profession actually is. Just let's have a conversation about that. But
Right.
the opportunity cost
Yeah.
of 5 or 6 years, and obviously if you're gonna if you're gonna waste, and I'm making air quotes here for the people listening, 5 or 6 years, then you better be damn sure this is what you want to do, even if
Yeah.
an econ PhD is kind of the best roll of the dice on that. But
Yeah.
the kids don't, they are so unaware of how many things there are out there. And I'm thinking of one student in particular, just off the charts, smart, hardworking, and seemed destined for a PhD. And then derailed is the wrong word. She just tried something different and discovered that she's really good at this other stuff, and is on now a different, incredibly successful pathway. And frankly, in some ways I look at that, I'm like, good that she figured out that she wanted to do something else, rather than doing what I did, which is kind of be pigheaded about the whole thing and say, well, this is what I decided I was going to do when I was 15, so this is what I'm doing.
Yeah. 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 Well, so what are you good at, John, that you could
I feel
imagine?
attacked by that question, Scott.
What are you good at that you could imagine that you could have done some other stuff that would have made you happy?
Honestly, I don't really know, because I love this job,
Yeah.
and not all of it, and not always, but it's hard for me to imagine that I would have been happier doing something else. I'd
Mhm.
like to think that I'm more of a generalist, and so I think that I'd be decent at adapting to other things. But there's not, it's not like I'm pining to have been a surgeon or something like that. And there are certainly things that I wish I was good at. Right, in addition to being at least moderately okay at this particular job.
So you're reading this, you're in the ninth grade, you like uh you want to become an economist, you're at this school where they're sending kids to top schools, and you end up being one, you end up at Princeton. I was wondering, who at Princeton, what were the authors and professors that had the most impact on you when you were at Princeton?
Well, so Harvey Rosen, without a doubt, who is still a good friend of mine. We talk frequently, even though he is now retired, and was a frequent co-author of mine for 15 years. So the way I got to know Harvey was, Princeton has these freshman seminars with really prominent faculty, a really small, 10 to 15 students. So you might take up poetry with Toni Morrison, or Robert Fagles, who's the sort of the translator, the most prominent translator of the Iliad and the Odyssey. 15 students on Homer, and Harvey taught a seminar on taxation. And I said, well, that seems interesting. And so that's how I got to know him. And then I connected with him. The summer after my freshman year, I just sort of asked around, does anyone need a research assistant? And at that point, I actually got connected with Burt Malkiel, and I did some RA work for Burt for a few years, and kind of on the side, and helped him out with Wall Street Journal op-eds, just sort of fact checking stuff like that. And then after my freshman year, I started working with Harvey, and we started working on a paper with Doug Miller, who at the time was a PhD student at Princeton. So, again, I was an undergrad, Doug was a PhD student. This is all many years ago. And we worked on a paper using the panel study of income dynamics and looking at the relationship between health and wealth. And this is sort of we can start to dive into the weeds here, but this is sort of a more of an old style IV paper where you kind of glance at your IV and you say, that's good enough, and you build a story around it, and then run your regressions. So very different style than the way that things are done today. But I took second semester econometrics with Worley Ashenfelter. And I took a class, and I've actually had the opportunity to tell Hank Farber this, that I took a phenomenal class from him, which was sort of a third semester econometrics class that was, an applied econometrics class of the sort that kind of opens your eyes to, hey, here are the kinds of problems you can solve with these tools that you've been learning kind of abstractly.
Right.
And I don't know that I can point to anything specific from that class, but that definitely, I think, solidified my desire to really do that kind of work. And at the same time, I was taking classes in other things. I took a macro seminar with Michael Woodford, who's with whom I under whose supervision I wrote a second thesis, and I took a game theory class with Dilip Brew, and in doing so, I learned that I am neither good at nor want to do macro or game theory, but that that's how you learn.
These were upper level classes, or were these graduate classes?
These were just upper level undergrad classes, though later when I got to grad school, I would actually find that they were essentially light versions of a first year macro seminar, or in Dilip Brew's case, a second year field game theory class. But similarly, Avinash Dixit taught intermediate micro the year I took it. Wow. And I used my notes from that class to review stuff for micro theory in grad school. So it was taught at extremely high level. You
were taking classes from real legends. Did you know that when you were there?
Not really. You kind of have a sense when, someone is prominent, but, especially again, narcissism of the young, everyone's just kind of old, right? And some people are old and they have their name on a book. And so that must mean that they're reasonably famous. You don't really have a great sense of who these people are and how they fit into, into the pantheon of things.
Right. Well, so who writes you a letter for, for grad school?
So Harvey, Mike Woodford, and Burt Malkiel were my letter writers for grad school. But and it was sort of I was less aware of having to do all the heavy duty math. I had done quite a bit of it, but college is a transition. Some of especially my early math grades weren't necessarily all that great. And I think this is again one of those places where the signal really matters in terms of coming out of a place like Princeton with, some of the grades that were on my transcript. I think, you come out of a different place with that and nobody really looks at you again. So like I said, better lucky than good, so I've been really, really fortunate to end up where I am, I think, through opportunities that I then went after, and kind of being at the right place at the right time, I think, is my elite skill.
That's a good skill, taking advantage of luck. So you end up at Stanford, where you must have been super, super pumped.
Yeah, I was. It was sunny, and though it was not, especially then, was not really a place set up for the kind of work that I wanted to do. And at the time, it was in a bit of disarray in terms of people transitioning in and out, and sort of some intra-departmental issues that you're not really aware of as a grad student, but you can kind of tell that stuff isn't quite right. And so I kind of limped through a good part of my Stanford experience, but again, it all turns out great for me.
Wait, so what did you want to do? You were wanting to do something like public finance?
Well, so that was actually, I thought that I was going to come in and do a lot of this. I knew I didn't particularly want to do the health stuff that I had done, the first two papers that I'd done with Harvey, which were done by the time those were my senior thesis, those two papers. And then I thought I wanted to do kind of, more classic tax type public finance. And then this is, again, one of these lucky opportunities. So Harvey had been in the George W. Bush administration on the Council of Economic Advisors, and when he came back to Princeton, he was casting around for new projects and stuff like that, and was approached by the development staff of, let's call it, Anonymous University, and they said, "Hey, we have these amazing data on alumni giving, but we don't really know what to do with it. We don't really know how to analyze it, et cetera. Would you be interested in helping us out with that?" And so he calls me up and says, "Hey, do you want to do this?" And at the time,
you're a PhD student at Stanford.
I'm a PhD student at Stanford, and Harvey's back at his role at Princeton. And so,
real quick, are you sort of before that phone call, kind of being routed into like a different field or a different research interest, or is this kind of like consistent?
I'd say I was fairly directionless
at
that time. I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do and how I wanted to do it. And I don't know that I had a particular interest in charitable giving, but we had these amazing data, and the first thing that we tackled, other than the sort of the report that Anonymous University wanted, was looking at the relationship between the age and application status of alumni children and their donations, and trying to kind of quantify these impure motivations for giving. And
what does that mean? Wait, okay, the what child? What was that?
The age and application status of alumni children. So if you have a 15-year-old who we know in the data will be applying to Anonymous University in 3 years, how does your pattern of giving change relative to someone who is observationally very similar but doesn't have a child, or is observationally very similar but whose child does not eventually apply? And then what happens if the child is accepted or rejected? What happens if the child
bribes? These are bribes.
Well, so that's the interesting thing, because it's, so first of all, if you're writing a check and putting it in an envelope, then you're probably not giving enough to move the needle anyway. But as opposed to getting into your jet and flying for the naming ceremony. Right. But there is certainly no explicit promise of anything like this, and this is entirely what we refer to as expected reciprocity. So sort of this is like I'm going to do something nice for you, and maybe you'll do something nice for me, despite the fact that at this university there's just not the way these things really work, and I know that people are skeptical about that, but I can assure you that the admissions office doesn't know that you gave $1,000 this year instead of $100. It's just not how it functions. And yet this pattern is incredibly consistent in the data, and we sort of used it to quantify how much you might think of as a more impure, mercenary, expected reciprocity motivation for giving. And that kicked off a number of papers, including my job market paper, using those data, because they're just such a rich data set to examine, not questions, not marketing questions, right? Not questions of like, well, how do you extract the most money, but questions about human behavior. So my job market paper ended up being, what's the impact of social pressure and charitable giving, by using as good as random assignment of roommates to this university. And then, 2 decades later, your freshman year roommate to whom you were randomly assigned, with whom you may or may not have a positive social relationship, but you were essentially randomly assigned to this person. Now they're a solicitor. So how does your giving vary, including within your giving history, so within an individual fixed effects approach, and so how much of these motivations to giving are driven by maybe external factors? And
I just Bayesian updated when you said randomized roommate, and I'm sort of now limited it to Anonymous University to a smaller set.
Okay, well, fair enough. I don't know that it's that big of a mystery, but I have never let it slip. It's just Anonymous University.
Got it.
And so, similarly, looking at,
is it a panel? Are you following these families?
Yes. So
what happens if the kids don't get in?
So this is giving drops to the level of someone who has no child at all, which is the what I call the I have no son result. And so you might say, well, why doesn't it drop even below that level? And the answer is we were looking at eldest children, because that was
Oh
the
yeah.
ones for whom the data was richest. If we looked at youngest children, for whom we had a much smaller data set of college age youngest children, it did in fact drop below that level. So there was, maybe some updating on how likely this was to
Mm.
work, or what, but certainly it was just this huge plummeting. But it also dropped for people whose kids did get in, and a lot of it shifted to more directed giving. So if your child was on the debate team, then you were maybe more likely to give to the debate team rather than to the unrestricted fund.
Right. Right. Yeah. It seems like if it's bribery, even if it's not real bribery, it's the impure motive. It seems like it's got to drop if they don't get in.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It didn't work,
Yeah.
and you didn't keep up your end of the deal,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
Yeah. Huh. What about people that are in the control group? Do they
So
do they just they're obviously not getting, the childless families or whatever. What happens to them at that same point in the like in that hazard model? What's going on with them?
Well, so we're using them as just a baseline group, right? So they're essentially picking up our age effects and our life cycle effects and stuff like that. And so everything that we did was relative to a control group of people without children.
But do they see like at that same age like their own gradual secular decline in giving? Is
So
it like they
that's a
get
great
worse?
question.
Is it like they are getting worse than the comparison group?
So that's a really good question. And you know what? We never actually plotted them out, just plotted it in the data. We always just had them as the, kind of the zeroed out group. But in a different paper, a much later paper, we looked at end of life giving,
Mm.
what how people's giving patterns change towards the end of their lives. And that one, really more was more of a descriptive paper, just trying to look at this idea of what happens towards the end of people's lives. And so
Mm.
we scraped the alumni magazine for obituaries to try to see where, was this like what was the cause of death, stuff like that, and looking to see, these declines in people's giving as they approach death. But again, you don't know what's driving it. Is it precautionary savings? Is it bequest motivation for other bequests? Is it what? But just documenting that, I think, is
Mm.
sometimes interesting. And I think that the profession is maybe coming back from this a little bit, but there is certainly a pretty long era where the causality police, would sort of turn up their nose at the very idea of just documenting interesting patterns.
Yeah.
And the question is, do you need a PhD in economics to document those interesting patterns? And perhaps you don't, but sometimes, there's just facts, not an evidence. So I have a fairly recent paper with my former PhD student, Ben Friday, where we look at the relationship between income, wealth, and giving, which is something you'd think would be fairly well documented. And yet, it tends to be all just, here are the numbers without any effort to adjust for age or other things, and then in particular to look at the effects of income and wealth both jointly and separately, and to try to think about what does it mean to say that people with a higher level of income give more. Do they give more out of their as a percent of their income or what? And then there's this common trope of well, it's low income people who give the highest percent of their income, which is true if all you're doing is looking at the data. But it turns out that a lot of those are older people who have fairly high wealth and low
Mm.
income. And
Oh.
there's a lot of outliers. So and some of those may just be data errors where someone reported $1,000 in income and they gave $50,000 in charitable giving. Well, that one observation in the PSID is by itself, I think in one case we documented that it almost doubled that vintile's average percent giving. And similarly you find things like people with negative wealth tend to be more generous than people at the median wealth level. Well, who has negative wealth? Very often it's young professionals, doctors and lawyers who have a lot of debt, but who have very high lifetime levels of income. And so I think this is one of those cases where if you're just a data monkey and you make pretty graphs, and then you come up with some just so story about how, look at this is all about these incredibly poor people who are so generous, the people with very low levels of income and negative levels of wealth. Well, that may be true, but one should dig a little bit more deeply into the data. And I think when we turn up our nose at descriptive papers, we kind of cede that ground to policy advocates and people who are maybe less well equipped to think deeply about these kinds of questions.
Yeah. Hey, I had this really interesting interview yesterday with David Card, and I was asking him, well, what was it like in in grad school? I had heard him comment that there was like an empirical crisis in labor in the 70s. And he said a lot of interesting stuff, and I kind of wanted to get your reaction to it. He said that in empirical papers, nobody believed the results. The empirical papers were presented for the methods, but nobody really believed the results. And I was curious, like, to what, if you hear something like that now, do you think that describes at all how you feel about the empirical work that you sort of see around you? Would you say like you have that level of skepticism, like I don't believe the results? Because the way you were describing it, so deep in the data, I just was curious how do you think it's different for you compared to the way he described that?
Well, so I'd say I take empirical results seriously, but not literally. And I think that everything we do is context specific, right? And so, even if you've got data for the entire United States, you have, the LEHD or whatever, and you say, here's the elasticity of whatever with respect to whatever, well, does that apply during COVID? Maybe not, right? Does it apply in 2030 when GPT-7 is, folding our laundry for it? Maybe not, right? So, do we learn something about the world? I think we generally do. I'd say it's just to say that, well, obviously the number is, negative 0.17 and now it's chiseled in stone. I mean, I don't, does anyone think that? I don't know, but we learned something. And one thing that actually does bother me, I think in the literature, and this is, more in some literatures than others, is kind of this law of one paper, and there's this chase for novelty, and you can couple this, especially when it's a politically fraught topic, with counterintuitive claims, especially if they tend to flatter one set of policy preferences over another. It's like, okay, well, we had this one paper and it was published and it was published in a top journal, and therefore now we're done, right? And that, to me, that's not science. And I'm not even talking about replications, which that's its own separate crisis, or extensions or things like that. It's just, well, here's a paper from 2011 and it's very similar to your paper, and so therefore why do we think your paper is worth publishing? Well, it's a different context. It's been 10 years. It's and I'm it's a different identification strategy and a different approach. And I'm not saying novelty should have zero weight on it, but I think it certainly has, in my view, too much weight. And so there is this chase for here's this kind of very surprising finding, and I think very often what we found is that those don't always replicate. But I do think nothing is externally valid 100%, right? No one is giving us the deep primitives, and if you want to channel your inner Hayek, well, those things can change also, right? The problem is not gathering all the information, it's that the information may change, and the preferences may change, and the way people behave may change.
Totally.
And so, again, like, I mean, COVID was a great example, right? There were all sorts of things where, if you had sort of blindly tried to apply whatever consensus numbers from 30 years of labor research to what was going on during the COVID crisis, you would have just been wrong, because this thing was different. That doesn't mean we know nothing, right? But we just need some more humility, and I think Greg Mankiw wrote a phenomenal piece. I want to say it was in National Affairs, but I might be wrong about that. This is a long time ago. And it was just a call for humility, and it was a call for humility in macro, which really does need a lot more humility. But I think that we need more humility in our applied micro fields, where stuff should be built off of a preponderance of the evidence, not here's the one paper that upends 30 years of education economics. It's really more we're learning stuff, and we learn it incrementally.
Right. Totally. Yeah. There's something about the scarcity of the journals or something where, there's some sort of filtering decisions that get made at the journal level where, I mean, that's where it seems like it happens. It's everybody looks for novelty, because otherwise they're not going to get into the QJE.
And when we say, what's of general interest, right? Well, what does that really mean, general interest? It's really what is interesting to the editors of the top journals. And I don't get me wrong, these are not bad people, and there's no conspiracy to keep certain things out, which, I think is something that people always leap to. But it is, I do think, and this is obviously not a novel point from me, that we have way too much hierarchy in journal rankings in economics, when there's so much noise, and the difficulty of publishing a paper in a top journal is extremely high. The percent accepted is ludicrously low, which means there's a ton of noise in the process. And yet you would think what that would mean is that there'd be more respect for papers published in non-top 5 journals, and yet it seems like the obsession with the top 5 has gotten worse over the last 20 years, to a degree that is kind of absurd.
Yeah, sure. So you get to A&M, what year is that? Like
2009.
09. Okay. And so I was curious, what was your tenure experience like going up and those years leading up to it? How'd you navigate that?
So again, I was very lucky, and my tenure experience was I think fairly unusual compared to most people. So when I took 7 years to finish at Stanford, and that was mostly because I really like biking in the sunshine in California. Now the downside to this was I delayed for long enough that I ended up going out in the 08-09 crisis, which was not a happy experience, though. Ending up at A&M, I think it's hard for me to imagine that my career would have gone better, and more importantly, that I would have been happier if I had ended up somewhere else. But I got here, I want to say, with 8 or 9 papers, of which like 5 were already published in pretty decent journals. And so you
went on the market with all that?
Yeah.
You were publishing.
Remember, I got started when I was 19 years old with Harvey.
Oh, right.
And so not because I was super smart or like leapt ahead. I just got, again, like incredibly lucky that someone like Harvey took me under his wing and treated me seriously. And we co-authored papers instead of me just being the RA.
Right.
And I did write those papers were my senior thesis. And so and then I wrote a vocational education paper in grad school, just because it was something I found really interesting. And then I got into the charitable giving stuff, at which point I had, I think, 3 or 4 charitable giving papers already in the hopper by that point. And so
it seems like you figured out your own research production function a lot sooner than like anyone I've ever heard of. Then
I think this was because I started so early. I think I paid that fixed cost when I was like a sophomore and junior in college, rather than as a 3rd or 4th year PhD student, because all of that hidden curriculum, stuff. Shout out to another great podcast. You know, all of that stuff that we don't know about doing research, you know, all those dumb mistakes we make, you know, that I can now tell, you know, students the story of how I thought it was a good idea to just, you know, just keep saving the file, right? You don't do things in do files. You just, you know, you just save, replace. Big mistake, right? And so all of those things that you learn, it's way better to learn them when you're 19 or 20 than when you're, you know, when you're a third or fourth year PhD student. And so I think that's right. You know, I think I had those ideas about the craft of research. And again, with someone like Harvey guiding me, the craft of research down in a really meaningful way before I got to grad school. And so I was able to be really productive. And then I got here and I was very well supported by my senior colleagues. And this was a place, you know, that really valued supporting junior people. And so, you know, I kind of felt like I knew it was pretty much in the bag, which gave me the freedom to do things like start an undergraduate research program when I was a second year assistant professor, which is again like the sort of thing that you would normally grab someone by the lapels and shake them and tell them this is a terrible use of your time. But it was something I really wanted to do, and gave me the opportunity to you know, mentor and guide undergrads and kind of work on that aspect of what I enjoy doing.
Yeah. So what do you think when you compare yourself to a counterfactual, which, you know, there's plenty of counterfactuals, you just see so many, you know, assistant professors, what do you think your production function was that made it work so well? Like if you had to just summarize it, you know, like this is my production function, this is how I'm able to take inputs and turn them into outputs, and this is why it happens so consistently. What was it that you had aside from prior pubs?
So I'd say at the risk of being a little bit, I think I have an extremely high marginal product of labor, but it also declines really quickly. And so I think that being aware of that means that I would work really intensely for a few hours a day and make really good progress, and then just say, okay, now I'm going to do something else, whether that's biking or, you know, or working on a different project or just sitting around thinking, or, you know, watching TV. But whatever it was, I kept myself from getting worn out, I think. And by keeping that balance, I was able to move forward quickly on a lot of different projects rather than saying, well, I'm just going to keep beating my head against the wall on this thing, which of course is not to say that there aren't, you know, a half dozen projects that got really far along that never ended up going anywhere. And sometimes that still makes me really sad, but it just that approach of, you know, let me get really into this thing for as long as I'm feeling like I'm making good progress, and then I'm just going to step away from it, because once that MPL has fallen to a pretty low level, there's just not much point in continuing today.
Yeah. Sure. So this charitable giving, I mean, you pivot at some point, or at least diversify, because you start writing about these traditional labor policy questions like the minimum wage. And so I'm curious, you know, a lot of people, well, I don't know if this is true, but this is true for me. You know, you couldn't pay me to write a minimum wage paper because, you know, I'm too sensitive of a man. I get my feelings hurt. And it seems like, you know, there's this quote from season 2 of Ted Lasso where there's a fake Brene Brown, fake Brene Brown book, and it's called Enter the Arena, but Bring a Knife. And I was thinking about that with the minimum wage literature. It seems like it's you have to have pretty thick skin, and yet you sort of jumped right into it. I was just wondering, for the sake of the listener, can you tell us a little bit about, you know, your decision? What was it that you spotted early on that said, I want to go into it? And how come did you bring a knife?
Well, so I think that the answer is it was lack of knowledge that's what it was like. And so the way we got into this, Jeremy West, who's our former PhD student who's at UC Santa Cruz, he and I, this was right at the time of the Affordable Care Act. And I was looking at all the mandates that the Affordable Care Act was putting forth, employer mandates. And I said, look, these have to these have to have some effect, right? I mean,
Right.
they're costly, and so that's part of compensation that shifts the mix. And so I said, Jeremy, let's see, let's collect all of these state level mandates and see what we can find in terms of effects on the labor market. And so it turns out we found what everyone else finds, which is that it's just kind of mushy. There's just not a whole lot there. It's pretty noisy. And Jeremy comes to me and says, I threw in the minimum wage as a control variable because it seemed like, was the sort of thing that would make sense. And it's like, it's always negative and statistically significant on everything I do. And he's like, and I always thought, Carden Kruger. And so, yeah, me too. I always, that's law of one paper, right? And so I said we dove into this having no idea that this was such a fraught discussion. And then again, better lucky than good, our paper came out right around the time in about 2013 that the minimum wage became a politically hot topic again. And so that's right when our paper hit. And we again kind of surfed this wave of the new minimum wage literature where we were one of the first movers on it. So I had no idea that it was going to be like this. And in many ways, I had thought naively that, someone who mostly works on charitable giving and Jeremy mostly works on sort of, environmental and IO type stuff. Like, well, we're not one of these, warriors in this holy war. And so, people will treat us with kindness and respect, which was in retrospect, a ludicrous idea in academia. But that's so the answer is I had no idea that it was going to be like that.
Yeah, you brought a pen. You brought a pen.
Yeah. I foolishly brought a pen and some regression tables.
But you've kept working on it. How many papers on the minimum wage have you written so far? Like 4 or 5?
4 or 5, something like that. And again, when I'm interested in aspects of it. So Jeff Clemens, Lisa Kahn, and I wrote a couple of papers because we were really interested in this idea of substitution to maybe higher skilled labor, more educated, more experienced labor. Seemed like the sort of thing like the minimum wage has to have effects somewhere, right? It's not it can't be a magical transfer of unless what you're doing is you're on the whiteboard drawing the perfect monopsony, with perfect wage with perfect wage discrimination, you don't even get this result. But it's just this idea that it's not going to have an effect somewhere. Well, it doesn't necessarily have to have an effect, especially in the short run on employment, right? It could be hours of work, which is what the Seattle Minimum Wage Project found. It could be shifting towards more skilled labor. It could be changes in the expectations of productivity from workers. This goes all the way back to this paper that you and I have discussed in the past from 1915, written by these 2 women who worked for the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It could be changes in non-wage compensation, which is the other paper that Lisa, Jeff, and I worked on. And so, it's unfortunate it's become such a politicized thing, but and I don't necessarily have a huge interest in writing, yet another minimum wage paper. I have no interest in cranking these things out every 2 years or so. But when there's an aspect of it that's interesting, like a paper I wrote with our former PhD student Carly Will Sloan and former undergrad Camilla Adams, who's now at Brown as a PhD student, was on search effort, right? Because that's something that was in a paper by Chris Flynn and a separate paper by Jordan Acemoglu, was this idea that the minimum wage might get people off the sidelines and they might search harder, and that might create better matches, which creates more more surplus, and then with that additional surplus, the employer doesn't feel the need to cut labor, right? And so those are theory papers, and those 2 guys are about 1 million times smarter than I am, but that is an empirically testable hypothesis, right? And so that's what we did. We used the American Time Use Survey. So it's kind of like a sliver of this topic, but it was something that I just found interesting, and I kind of wanted to know the answer to. So off I went. And got to work with 2 great young people, which is really one of my favorite things to do.
Because you're a social person.
Yeah.
That's a part of your production function. You enjoy being around people.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. The work takes a long time. doing it alone is would be hard. It's hard for anybody, but I wonder if you also are a happy economist. You seem like a happy economist if because you part of your production function is you figure out how to throw these cocktail parties, but for papers.
I think that's definitely part of it. I also, I really enjoy talking to other people about their work, and so there's just
Mhm.
sometimes it just pops in my head. Oh, I haven't talked to so and so in a while. I
Yeah.
wonder what they're up to, and
Right.
then just hearing about cool stuff that they're working on is just really, really enjoyable. There's just so many amazingly smart people in the profession, and very often, I mean, the phrase I use is I find it recreationally interesting. It might just be a topic that I don't work on, have no plans to work on, but it's just interesting. I just want to know more about it. And, not to take away anything from the people who live in their silos and they find the topic that they work on so interesting that they're not compelled by anything else. That's totally fine,
Yeah.
teach his own. But for me, there's just stuff all over the place that I find super interesting, even if I
Right.
have no intention of ever working on that topic.
Right. Well, it's top of the hour. I wanted to kind of conclude a little bit. You're such a thoughtful person and social, and you've observed a lot. I wonder if there's anything that you think is like maybe not hidden curriculum, but like missing information that the new junior faculty or the kind of the sort of deep in the PhD program student that maybe you think really does have a very high marginal benefit for them, and they just really for whatever reason need somebody to tell them what it is there anything that you think really has a very high marginal benefit in terms of like whatever you think whatever you think the goals should be or are?
Well, I think that this probably won't surprise you, but I think it's talking to people. And this is such a point of emphasis for me when I talk to my young PhD students, is that nobody goes into a cave and emerges 2 years later with a perfect paper, and it's
Mm,
so easy to get blinders on about your topic, and the last thing you want is to be standing in a seminar for the first time and have someone point out something like really obviously flawed. But even beyond that, even just getting that kind of feedback is this is how ideas germinate, right? And this is how
right.
ideas expand. And someone might say, that's fine, but hey, did you ever think about like what if you applied it in this other way? And you're like, oh my God, that's like a million times more interesting. But I
Mm,
had gotten so focused on the thing that was right in front of me, that I didn't even notice that the interesting thing about this would be something else. But again, that's often someone else's opinion, right? And the thing that
yeah.
someone else finds interesting might not be the thing that you want to work on, and that's okay. But you'll never know if all you do is sort of put your head down and work on your stuff. So just talk to people. If you're a
Mm,
PhD student, talk to your peers. If you're faculty, talk to PhD students, talk to other faculty at other places, especially talk to senior faculty. Make sure that you have at least one person, preferably more, in your department who you can go to with questions. Or better yet, someone senior outside of your department. And I try
yeah.
to be this person for a lot of people, because
Yeah.
sometimes you don't want to ask that question in your department. You're like, hey, I got asked to do this thing, but like, I want to be a team player, but this sounds like a huge pain in the ass. So like, is this good for me or not? And I
Right.
think every junior faculty needs someone outside of their department that they can ask that question to. And very often it's their advisor, right?
Yeah.
Their old advisor. But to not be able to say, hey, is this a good thing for my career? Because you often have no idea when you're a young faculty member, because you don't know that 5 years from now people will be like, oh, you know what, they edited a handbook chapter, that's a pretty big deal. Or like, man, that guy just spent all his time on like BS service that didn't, and well, that wasn't that their fault, because no one ever told them, hey, you're allowed to say. I actually just had this conversation with someone the other day. If you're taking on a big piece of service, you're allowed to say no to everything else, and that's
Mm,
a really important thing to know. And this was actually a recently tenured person, and they
mm.
didn't know that they were allowed to kind of turn down other stuff if they were being handed this really big piece of service.
Right. Well, it's so good to see you as always. I love when we hang out. And COVID sucked because we and you didn't get to hang out in person, but I hope we can get to see each other again soon in
For sure.
person.
Pretty soon over drinks, I hope.
Yep, deal. All right, good to see you, buddy. Bye bye.
Take care, Scott.
Gotta see us through.